Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. I'm sorry we were delayed a little bit because Sam Palmisano was delayed a little bit. He's over at the White House right now, but he'll be here shortly to round out the panel, and we look forward very much to hearing from this group. My name is John HAMRE. I'm the president at CSIS and want to welcome you, and we're delighted to have the opportunity to have the commission leadership here to explain this very important work that they did through the last year. Before we begin with our public events, we always start with a little safety announcement. I'm the responsible safety officer. I'm going to take care of everybody today, so if anything happens, nothing's going to happen, but if anything happens, please follow my instructions. We're going to go right out through this exit. It's 4 or 5 feet away from the stairs that take us down to the street. We'll go down to the street. We'll go around the back to the National Geographic. We have a mutual support arrangement. I'll order ice cream, and then we'll sing a song of praise for our salvation, and we'll be just fine. But just follow my instructions in case we need to do anything, please. I've had the privilege of serving on presidential commissions before, and one that I actually chaired, and I'll tell you, there's that haunting thing of every commission is anybody going to pay any attention? This is always the problem when you're asked to come together. It's an enormous amount of work it takes to put these things together. It's an enormous amount of work. These are the finest intellects we have in America. And we're asking them to take days out of their normal lives to focus on something for the nation. This was an especially interesting, challenging commission because its work came very close to the end of an administration. I think of it as an opportunity because this means that the Trump administration has a clean, neutral starting point with experts that looked at a problem that's huge for the country and have given them a great roadmap on how to proceed. And we're going to explore that roadmap today. We're fortunate we will have, when Sam gets here, we'll have both of the co-chairs here. We've got other commissioners, but Kirsten Toth is going to be the moderator for the discussion, and I'm going to let her take the lead at this stage to introduce this morning's discussion. We have a lot of opportunity, especially for you to engage with your questions, to draw out the deep nuances that are inside this very good report. So thank you all for coming, and Kirsten, let me turn to you.
Thanks very much. And thanks very much to everyone for being here. We are fortunate to have such a distinguished panel, and I'll walk through the introductions. I think one of the things that's been on everybody's mind has been the EO, and so the good news is who would have thought 4, 6, even maybe 3 years ago that we'd be all waiting with bated breath for an EO on cybersecurity, but we are, and that's a fantastic thing, and that I think demonstrates the importance of this issue and how we're all looking at the criticality of it, both for national security as well as economic security. And so what we'll do today is we're going to look at some of the key issues that are informing this administration. And to Dr. HAMRE's point, the idea of the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity from the beginning was that it would be a roadmap for the incoming administration and be able to truly inform cyber policy based on background. The work of the CSIS task force was similar. And I think what's important is that you are looking at these two bodies of work, these two nonpartisan bodies of work that are informing what the administration is doing on cybersecurity. And I think we'll all be looking very closely to see what the EO says, and certainly appreciate what the administration is doing and taking its time and the deliberate process that's gone through with the EO and what the outcome will be. So with that, I will introduce the 3 panelists right now, and we'll start. I'll have Tom do a couple of remarks, but first, Tom DONILON, who's a vice chair and partner at O'Melveny. Tom was the chair of the commission and the former national security advisor to Barack Obama, President Obama, with a long distinguished career in public service. Next to him is Steve Chabinsky. Steve served in the FBI and was general counsel at CrowdStrike, and now serves as the chair of a global data and privacy practice at White & Case. And Karen Evans is currently the national director of U.S., I always want to call it Cyber Command, U.S. Cyber Challenge. And Karen ran the crosscut on IT for the Trump administration, as well as chaired the East Coast component of the CSIS task force. So with that, I will turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit about the commission and open up our event. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. And John, thanks for having us here today. Delighted to be here. And very appreciative of the work that you all have done in this area and many other areas. Really just a tremendous resource for the country here. And never more important, actually, just to talk on think tanks for 30 seconds, if I can get an extra 30 seconds on my presentation. At a time of change, the intellectual capital and ideas, new approaches, keen appreciations of the dynamics in the world have never been more valuable, I think, for people in government. I certainly appreciated it when I was in government. It was easy to get in the echo chamber when you're inside the government and talk on every issue with the same 10 people every day. And so the work that CSIS does, along with a number of counterpart think tanks in Washington, is really, really important stuff, and I think an important institutional part of how we make policy in the United States. So much appreciated. On the commission, we had a short runway, right? And Kirsten can tell you more than anybody. The president appointed the commission in the late winter, and our report was due December 1st. Late winter of 2016, and our report was due by December 1st of 2016. So we had a short runway, but we had a superb group. And I wanted to just underscore that this really was a really kind of a member-driven process, and that resulted from the people who were on the commission. It was a thoroughly nonpartisan. It was made up of a number of people, not just from the policy world, but from the technical world as well. Very technically proficient group of an experienced group of commissioners, and I think that's unusual, by the way. I think in my experience, I've done a number of commissions. It's usually have a group of policy people who are being informed by technical people in the background. These were technical people out front on the commission, really with deep experience, and it showed, by the way. I think because the report really is, I think, in terms of clearly up to date on the policy debates in the country, but also quite current and cutting edge on the technical side of this, and that's an important piece of that, and something that is frankly missing sometimes in the policy debates in the government. We also held, in Kirsten's direction, a series of public hearings around the country to inform ourselves with respect to different perspectives. I thought the hearings were tremendously successful. And really did inform a lot of the thinking on this in our final product. And we had great participation, I thought, from folks, very thoughtful. And the whole written record is on the commission website. And I'd really encourage you to take a look at any areas that you are particularly interested in. On the topic itself, so my former colleague, General James Clapper, who was the Director of National Intelligence, for a number of years had been giving his global threat assessment, which he does every year on Capitol Hill. And over the last 3 or 4 years, he has stated that cybersecurity was the principal threat to the United States. And there was some debate about that when Jim first came to that conclusion, right? And including with myself, right? Who was I've sat in the National Security Advisor job. There's a lot of things going on in the world, Jim, right? And this is it, and he was insistent on it, and he turns out to have been right, as he is about most things. And so it's there as the number one threat from the perspective of the intelligence community to the United States. The next point I would make, and we make this point in our report, is that although we have done a lot on cybersecurity, we've invested a lot more money, it's gotten a lot more attention. Frankly, the national effort is not commensurate with the threat yet, and that was really one of the themes here, I think, in terms of the way we're organized, in terms of the amount of resources and focus that we give to this. If you compare it, for example, again, we say this in the report, and the front part of the report is really important. I'll get that in a second, because we lay out a set of background and a set of really important principles that Steve had a lot to do with designing, which I think are very important going forward. But the level of focus and effort is not commensurate with this being declared the number one threat, frankly. If you look at the amount of effort we put in this to our counterterrorism efforts, for example, or our overall homeland security efforts, it's not even close, right? And so this is really an important part of what we discovered here. The recommendations are, I think, quite useful, and I think for this administration too, because they're categorized in short-term, medium, and long-term. There are a number of things here that the current administration could undertake in the short term, which we think would make a significant impact. And of course, the acid test of the report is whether or not, if you take on all the recommendations, whether or not as the title of the report says, would cybersecurity be enhanced, right? That's kind of, and I have to tell you, my judgment, the judgment of the commissioners was if you undertook the steps laid out here, right, cybersecurity in the United States would be materially enhanced. I'll just finish up with a couple of themes after introducing the work, in just 2 or 3 areas. One is the government. That wasn't, by the way, the whole. Also, these commissions typically focus on the government structure. This wasn't the sole focus at all of this, and it's actually the 5th set of recommendations in the report, right? Because we wanted to get through kind of the whole digital economy, right, and what the threat was and what we can do to enhance cybersecurity. But with respect to the government, we make a number of recommendations on structure to try to raise up the visibility and the impact that the government can have. We recommend an assistant to the president for cybersecurity to get more focus and to have a locus in the government where policy making can be done on this, and not have kind of the bandwidth problems which you're always going to have when someone has multiple responsibilities going forward here. We dig deeply into enhancing the role and authorities of the government's CIO. Including overseeing really a development of standards and having the authority to enforce those standards, including having the ability, as we move towards, as we recommend, a single government network, right, to have the ability to actually move a federal agency off that network if they're not meeting the standards that are laid out, right? We know, as it's cliche in this world right now, that the weakest link in these systems is the critical vulnerability, and we really talk a lot about how to get to ensuring that the government can set standards and enforce those standards. We also call for the creation of an agency that oversees kind of from end to end cybersecurity services and protection, right, and resilience. We talk about moving the NIST framework, which has been a big success, right, in the private sector, moving that into the federal government. We talk about developing enterprise risk management as an approach in the federal government. We talk, I think, importantly about enhancing sharing between the federal government and the private sector. We make a number of specific recommendations aiming towards the goal of having immediate machine sharing, if you will, and trying to ensure that the same problem doesn't occur twice, right? But also, and getting underneath the question of why doesn't the private sector share as much with the public sector? What aren't they getting back right? We try to go through some specifics about how to make that better. And last thing I'll say about the government, we also call for the creation of a national public-private program, right, which would be comparable to the PAB, the Intelligence Advisory Board in the White House, to enhance information sharing, right? To have private sector, public sector have a formal place where they can go. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the future. And we focused in our report as one of the important things about the future is a focus on the Internet of Things or connected devices. And the fact is, of course, that there are not, that this, well, the phenomenon is exploding, right, with respect to, and with that, the vulnerabilities are exploding, right? And we don't have agreement on a set of standards, frankly. We don't have agreement, particularly with respect to these less expensive devices, right? We haven't really moved to security at the front end, or to security by design. The pressures are to get to market as quickly as possible. That's what's happening in the Internet of Things, frankly. And we make a 4 or 5 stage set of recommendations, which I think are really important. One, let's work through a NIST-like process to develop standards. Let's decide what is the minimum that you should have in these devices for security. Second, to develop a non-governmental organization, that would be able to review software and hardware and indicate whether they've met those standards and apply nutritional type labeling, right? So that a purchaser can make a determination whether or not the minimum standards are being met. The labeling is important. If that doesn't work, to consider what kind of regulation might, and to look at liability issues too. So the Internet of Things, I'd really recommend that you take a look. I think it's an important section of the report. Last thing I'll say is that we had a very important focus, I think, on workforce and consumer. There's been, whenever you have a situation where you have a demand for the jobs, cybersecurity in this case, where you have a premium willing to be paid by employers for these jobs, and you still have a shortage, you have a problem, right? There's some sort of failure here, and we try to address that failure, both inside the government and out, which has special issues inside the government. And last, in education, I think we have a very important piece here, although Steve has been a big proponent of it, and it's an important part of the report to try to move kind of at the front end as much as possible our cybersecurity. There still are important education pieces here going forward. Last thing I'll say is that we didn't address some things, right? Because they were not within our scope. We didn't address the encryption issue, for example, and we didn't address the .mil, kind of the military side of things. But as a personal comment at the end, I do think that part of the agenda that the new administration should work on, in addition to the number of things that we laid out here, is really a revitalization of trust between the federal government and the private sector. And that, I think, was one of the great prices, if you will, of Edward Snowden's horrific disclosure of some of the most important information in the government. And I would hope that would be part of the agenda too. So that's kind of a summary of some of our thoughts, and I'd be glad to have others comment.
Thanks very much. And I'll turn it over to Steve. And Steve, you represent the hybrid. You're strategically positioned in between. Steve served both on the CSIS task force as well as the commission.
I think to pull some of the threads, Tom, that you mentioned, the group was incredibly diverse, certainly nonpartisan, and it really brought to bear a lot of different points of view. What I think was remarkable was at the end of the day, my understanding, and certainly my personal belief, is that everybody agreed with all of the recommendations in this report, which is all the more incredible when you think about the diversity of the group. But what is interesting, I think, is I view the report almost as a shelf of ingredients. It's kind of like an Iron Chef moment, and any commissioner that you hear will make something different of it. So I will pick the ingredients, not that I disagree with any, but I'll certainly go after the ingredients that were most important in my view, not necessarily that I was the one that promoted them, but and so when I wrap it up into what I would say is the strategic approach, it might be quite different when you hear another commissioner talk about it, and they're all talking about the same thing, and we'd all agree with each other. So I do recommend, to the extent that you're interested in this area, to hear as many of the different commissioners speak. One of the things that I think we had to account for was the difference between short-term tactics, right? So what's tactical? What do we need to have in place right now versus what is the long-term vision? Where do we see this heading in the future? I myself tend to be tired, for lack of a better word, of the short-term tactical approaches, because I think they don't have really long-term prospects of success, but they really are needed now. And I always, in the security industry, as Kirsten had mentioned, I had a lengthy career with the FBI, over 15 years. And so in the security industry, you always hope to actually put yourself out of business. And that's the way I viewed my work on this commission. What could we do so that many, if not most of these recommendations over the long term are no longer necessary? And I remember making a comment to Pat Gallagher, who had been director of NIST, sitting next to me. We were all, I think, enamored of the NIST framework. Everybody, to a T, everybody, to a person, said that it's a great framework. And I said to Pat, I said, one day I hope we don't need that framework anymore, right, if we really do our jobs. And I felt the same way about workforce development, right? Why are we building up such a large workforce, taking what little STEM talent we have and sinking it into security? So I was hoping one day we won't need this workforce recommendation any longer. Information sharing, right? The idea of having the private sector and the government sharing all this information back and forth. One day, hopefully, we won't need all of that. So there are a lot of recommendations that I agree with at the moment that I really hope if we got the strategic recommendations right, we just won't need any longer. There was also somebody who said to me, well, a lot of those recommendations, we found those in other reports, almost as though the point of our commission was to be novel, and that there's some benefit in actually saying something that has not already been said if it were accurate and really still needs to be done. So I'm proud that the commission did not actually fall hostage to trying to be novel for the sake of novelty. And there are aspects of the report that take from others before us. And I think that that's quite a good thing. And I wouldn't discount those as being, old issues. I would say that those are important aspects that we still haven't done right. And that, when people continue to say the same thing for 15 years and we haven't done it, it's time to look at those, right? I wouldn't be readily dismissive. But where I like to focus is on the longer term strategy. How can I personally, after having been in this field for so long and as a result being somewhat disillusioned over time, right? How do you re-energize yourself to say that something really can change in the long term? And for me, there are 4 aspects of the report that I think taken together really do have or could have material consequences for making security better down the road. And I'll tell you the ones that I believe are most important for those long-term goals. One of them is threat deterrence, focusing on the bad actors. And this is something that came out loud and strong in the CSIS report. But it's also, although not as loud in the President's Commission report out there. I mean, at the end of the day, we have bad guys who are harming us. And to my mind, there is no aspect of security in a dynamic, interoperable environment that focuses on vulnerability mitigation as the first emphasis of security. It's not how we work in the physical world. We are not personally secure walking around the streets because we're wearing body armor and are impenetrable. Our buildings are not secure based on the gauge of the locks and the glass and the steel, right? At the end of the day, our nation itself is not covered by a force field. We find that deterrence really is the long-term focus on security efforts, unless you're going to bunker down and have no interoperability and stay the same, right? And that's just not how the internet is designed. It's dynamic, it changes all the time. By definition, it's supposed to be able to operate in an international environment. So I think that threat deterrence needs to be a focus. And if you look at where we spend our money currently, the resources and the costs are borne almost entirely by the victims of this crime for vulnerability mitigation. The federal government itself is spending over $15 billion in information security. I mean, and you're seeing this play out as well. We had one company that came before us that spent over $500 million last year with thousands of employees working in cybersecurity. I think that focus and those resources have to shift to go after the bad guys. It just is, this is not something that is sustainable. The second area after threat deterrence is moving the vulnerability mitigation as far away from the user's responsibility as possible. And I would say that our proposals look at that in 2 different ways. One is cleaning up what we would call the internet ecosystem. This is not a challenge that's just for telecommunications carriers. It really is an ecosystem. There are a lot of players that have an opportunity for the common defense, if you will, to weed out a lot of what we're seeing before it ever gets to the critical infrastructure, large businesses, small businesses, home users. A lot can be done at higher levels, but the market forces and incentives just aren't there. One thing that had fascinated me when I was on the commission is I had learned that we have something called a Connect America Fund for telecom and broadband, in which we're paying providers to bring communications into rural areas because there's no market incentive to otherwise do so. And this was not something that's in the recommendations of the report, but it had made me wonder how we could have a Connect America Fund but not a Protect America Fund if it's really about market incentives, right? Why aren't we paying the internet ecosystem, those who can get botnets and the delivery of automated, right, distributed malware away from the end users before it even gets to us? When I think about Flint, Michigan and other reservoir crises, you don't think about how are we going to force every user of water to have an incredible water filtration system. You think about taking care of it at its source. So we have aspects in here that talk about long-term trying to figure out ways that we can better incentivize the market to remove some of these problems as far away from the user as possible. Another way of getting it away from the user's responsibility is what Tom had mentioned about design elements of our hardware, our software, our protocols, and ensuring that we have security by design and full transparency in that way. And when we're talking about nutritional labels are really good for the home consumer. I can go in and look at a can of soup and understand that. I don't think anyone else, I shouldn't speak for anyone else, but I didn't envision that this is going to be the home consumer going into an electronics store and understanding the information on a router. But I do believe that sophisticated consumers, including the government, including businesses, large businesses, really will understand if the boxing had to say whether the coding was reviewed by a third party under standards that had been created. That's understandable. It's understandable what the life cycle of support is for a product if you have to disclose that we're not going to be supporting this for more than 2 years, right? If you've got a product that is out of support, you'll have to buy a new one. It's understandable if you write that there's a hard-coded password in here that you as the user cannot change. And if the bad guys find out, all of you are vulnerable. Those types of metrics that Tom had mentioned would be determined by a third party with NIST's help, I think could be enormously successful in driving this away from user error and user responsibility. And then the fourth, is a very strong emphasis in this report on metrics, on making sure that we actually know what's working and how that changes over time. I have really been quite frustrated over my years at seeing how many programs are put in place without recognizing whether or not they're efficient and effective. And so when I was speaking with someone who was very focused on cost effectiveness, and in risk management, that's quite an appropriate consideration, whether something is cost effective. But when I looked at most of the frameworks and guides and standards that we routinely deploy, and for which we find companies liable for not acting reasonably if they don't engage in them, you'll find that there is really very little, if any, information that can statistically show that those measures were effective, that they would be effective, meaning the following, that the bad guy wouldn't just do something different if that had been in place. It's easy to say someone fell victim to a crime, right, because their rear window was open, right? So that's how the bad guy got in. It's much more difficult, and we seem to forget that had that bathroom window been closed, what would they have done then, right? Then they would have just picked the lock, and on and on and on. We see that the bad guys don't just stop. So I think we've made a blunder in talking a lot about some of the basics as though the bad guy doesn't change, and that we don't really have any metrics to show this. So it became almost taken for granted that you would say to everybody, update your antivirus software, right? That was a common thing that government institutions, every government agency at the end of an advisory notice, this goes back to 1998 at least, because I know, because we were at my time at the National Infrastructure Protection Center, we were writing those. Well, now there are companies that don't even use antivirus software, finding that it's just not valuable any longer, that their money is better spent somewhere else. So this notion of updating a product that they're not even using falls short. So we need metrics. We need measurements to find out not only if something is cost effective, but if it's even effective. And I think the report does a very good job of emphasizing the need to figure out what strategies are working and how those might change over time, and then figuring out its cost effectiveness, also with a focus on small and medium enterprises. So that's how I would wrap up the long term. Getting back to the standard that was mentioned earlier, the report is meaningful if we believe that if some of these recommendations were taken, or all of them, that it would materially enhance cybersecurity. I believe we can really materially enhance cybersecurity over the short and long term, but we have to do things differently than we're doing them now.
Thank you, Steve. I want to just pull one thread before we go to Karen, which I think is very important, is there is often an approach in cybersecurity that you have to decide between the short-term solution and the long-term solution. And in doing so, you lose some of the momentum. And I think one of the things that the Commission did well, and I know the task force addressed it as well, is when you look at workforce and particularly security by the end user, it looked at both short-term solutions and long-term solutions, which aren't mutually exclusive. So for example, workforce, everybody talks about the need. There are two issues. It's the idea of training the current workforce and also building it out. But that it's not mutually exclusive from the need to invest in automation, in machine learning, and how all of that works together. And one of the initial issues that was posed to the Commission was, well, which way are you going to go? And the Commission said, well, you have to look at this sequentially. We have to invest in the short term, but you also have to invest in the long term, and they don't conflict with one another. And to Steve's point about security, just because you want to move security away from the end user, which is a goal that the Commission talked extensively about, doesn't preclude the need to inform consumers in the here and now, both for what they're doing, but also as a general sense in the digital economy for what their knowledge needs to be. And I think both you and Tom outlined both of those issues well. I think with that, we'll go to Karen.
Hi. So I was the co-chair for the CSIS task force, and I was looking at the title because ours is From Awareness to Action. So I had the opportunity to meet with the commission and talk to them about my background as 6 years running the IT for the federal government as a whole. You learn a lot, plus my responsibility at that time was to actually implement the Federal Information Security Management Act and make it a reality. So I'm one of the few people who can talk about the unintended consequences of the policies that you issue as it relates to cyber here. And so the task force got together and we had a little bit of a different focus. We also had, it was bicameral, so it was bipartisan bicameral. So we had Senator Whitehouse as a co-chair and we had Chairman McCall as a co-chair. And then Samir Boltra was co-chair of the West Coast. So what we were trying to do is get outside of the Washington bubble with the policy, taking into consideration things that the West Coast, Silicon Valley, their issues of what they needed. But we also took this approach of it had to be actionable. Anything that we would recommend had to be actionable. So as people would, and Steve was at several of those meetings, as people would throw out these wonderful ideas, we'd say, okay, and then how is the administration going to make that actionable? Because it's great to have these long-term visions, but if you can't tell them exactly what steps they need to do when they first go in to achieve that. And what we also did was try to take the approach of there are things that an administration does within the first 90 days that affect the next 4 years of what they do. So it may seem short-term, but it's actually really very long-term in nature. And we also knew that there's a series of executive orders, exactly where Kirsten started, that would come out and that would set the tone. So we wanted the report to really reflect principles that these executive orders should adopt as they go forward, because the agencies have action plans. There are a bazillion implementation plans. I know Steve and I probably developed several of these implementation plans. And what we all looked at was, why didn't those plans ever get implemented? Or why didn't we, if you take all the steps like in the commission's report, did you really enhance it? Why didn't you do it? We all know like what stopped it, and then tell this administration what stopped it so that they can remove that barrier in order to be able to implement these recommendations from both groups. So I think what you see from the groups there are similarities, because we know that these are the issues. There's short-term issues, there's long-term issues. We know that there are the workforce issues. We know the Internet of Things are out there. We know what those issues are, and there are things that have to get done. And there's an education process that happens with any new administration going in. And so that's really how we tried to lay things out. Plus, you guys specifically stayed away from encryption as co-chairs of From the Hill. We had to specifically address encryption. They really wanted us to really take a look at the topic of encryption, and we really went down the rabbit hole on that. And so that's a challenge. And I would really recommend that you take a look at this, because the way that we did this report, we have an executive summary that has the highlights. If we took every recommendation that came from our group, because we tried not to necessarily get consensus, because we knew that there's divergent views between the East Coast and the West Coast. What we wanted people to say, are you diametrically opposed to anything that's going to be said in this report? Are you going to be upset if your name is on here and there's something in here that is just really going to get you upset? That was the litmus test that we had on ours. And we released all the work papers, because there are over 130 recommendations that came out of these work groups. And so you can pull the thread by, if something really piques your interest through the executive summary, then you can go to the report and see the summary of the recommendations, and then you can actually go, wow, that's the summary. How in the heck did the task force get there? You can actually then go to the work papers and see who worked on that issue, how they presented it, and then there's two different viewpoints. So for example, on workforce, there are two different viewpoints about what the West Coast is saying that they need in workforce and what the East Coast is saying that they need in workforce. And the recommendations that the West Coast put forward versus the East Coast. And we thought it was really important that you could see how those are, because as this administration looks at this, those are opportunities to marry those up so that you can see exactly what industry is saying versus what Washington, D.C. is saying about what they need for workforce. So I'd like to highlight that particular one. And then workforce, obviously, is important to me because I continued to work on cybersecurity workforce issues when I left. The analogy I use is that we want a Major League Baseball team with all the teams. And we don't even have a T-ball team league, feeder league, right now. We have come up to, I would say now we have the T-ball team. We don't have the Little League and the Farm League. We're still building the Little League and the Farm League, but we want Major League players out on that field. And there's a finite set of those. So they move around. And that's that, you know, and if you're one of those Major League players, more power to you right now in the market because it's great. But we need to have more of those. And then the other thing that we really laid out is the concept of everyone, it has to take their part on. And this is a piece that I talked to the commission about in particular is the responsibilities of everyone in this chain, right? And so a secretary of a department or an agency can't come into an office and say, well, you know, I really like these particular issues, and I don't really have a big background in technology, so I'm not going to deal with the cybersecurity issue. And it gets relegated down to the CIO. And so what you see a lot of times in Washington, D.C. is that the CIO of an agency is spinning around, and the recommendations are also spinning around at the edges. But when it's all said and done, the secretary is the one who is in charge. Just like there is no ifs, ands, or buts in private sector, okay? Everyone knows the CEO is responsible for that, okay? Whether they have an IT background or not, they figure out how to complement their management team so that they can deal with that risk. You cannot just walk away from it in the federal government or the state government and say it's a CIO issue. So we hit on that, you guys hit on that. I think that is really key. And then we hit on a couple other principles, like we said there should be cyber acumen, which is this longer term issue. And every time I throw that out, everybody goes, oh, it sounds like the MBA program. It is, okay? Everybody has to have business acumen. Even if you're an IT person, you have to have business acumen. So it's at the point now where you have to have cyber acumen. And so you have to understand what the impact of this is in your aspect of your job. Whether you don't have to be the expert, but you have to have an acumen, you have to know about it because you're going to be making decisions and they're going to affect the enterprise. And that enterprise then feeds into the framework. The last thing that I would say is all of us agreed about NIST. And all of us agreed about the framework. And I will say Senator Whitehouse's biggest issue was performance measures, okay, and the performance metrics. It's one thing to have the framework out there, and people are saying they're following the framework. Well, how do we know that the framework is really effective? Not the efficiency part, but the effectiveness of the framework. And right now, I think what the framework really does is gives us now the ability to be able to talk to each other in a way that through multiple disciplines, we're using the same language, and we have a taxonomy that allows us to talk. So the next phase of this now is how do you put measures in place to know that those business processes that you're adapting to reduce risk are really effective and that you are doing a deterrence and you are protecting the information that you need to protect.
I want to follow up just really quickly on something that Karen says I think really important, and it was underscored in both of the efforts, right? Which is this issue of leadership and accountability. You know, that is, it's a direct lesson from the private sector, where over the last half a decade or so, the proposition that that a cybersecurity problem is just the IT person's responsibility, right, has been swept away, and the regulators and the plaintiffs bar and management generally, right, is driven towards the point which is accepted now that it's the CEO's responsibility and it's part of the risk management responsibilities that a board and a company has, right? And that needs to translate into the public sector as well, where the secretaries of each and the heads of each of the departments understand that it's his or her responsibility for cybersecurity, and if something goes wrong, they're going to be held accountable. Indeed, our recommendation would be that in the first cabinet meeting that President Trump has, right, that he would, or in an early cabinet meeting, that he would indicate to the secretaries and heads of departments that it's their responsibility. They're going to be called upon to report regularly. They're going to have to meet certain metrics, and if there's a failing in their department, it's their responsibility, and he would call them to account. And I think that's an important piece going forward here. This issue on, and both Steve and Karen mentioned this, on metrics is really important, I think. I mean, it is one thing, again, to say, let's pull the NIST framework through, but we also recommend the establishment of a cybersecurity framework metric working group. Sounds a little technical. It is, but it's really important, I think, going forward here to have not just the framework, but also the metrics that need to be met sector by sector.
Let me pull on, I think, each of your experiences, and when we look at authorities, and Karen, you mentioned your work with eGov, Steve, FBI, and then looking at this, and Tom, obviously, in the White House as the National Security Advisor. As we look at this issue, and as this development evolves, hello, Sam. We
You came in right at the perfect time.
Yeah, that's good.
Sam, is there anything you want to share with us before we move on?
I didn't read the executive order. I'm scheduled to do that at 3 o'clock.
Your arrival, we thought maybe you'd bring an envelope, almost like a
We
Faye
thought
Dunaway
maybe
and
you
Warren
had the
Beatty.
advanced copy.
At one point we did, and then they took it back.
Yeah, right.
So what I was just about to ask Sam, and looking actually at the different authorities and the perspectives, is as we look at cybersecurity, and as actually while we're waiting for this executive order, where do you think the authorities for cybersecurity lie? Tom, you just talked about the importance of obviously the agency heads, and we've had a lot of that discussion, and the commission had a lot of that discussion around the agency focus, but then also the embodiment of that power within the White House. Karen, you talked a little bit about policies and how they trickle down and the effectiveness of that, and Steve with the FBI, and then Sam, it would be great to get your perspective, and if you want to elaborate a little bit on the interface with industry as well. And I guess we can start with you, Sam.
I think that if you go through the view of the administration, right, which I just heard as of 5 minutes ago, their view of it is they have Tom Bossert, I guess, is now been given this authority, and they've retained an advisor, Mayor Giuliani, and they feel that they have this a focus now established within the White House. That's their view. But however, there are all these other people running around on the subject because they're working on the re-engineering of government. So you have Chris Liddell, who was GM, CFO of General Motors and Microsoft, and Jared Kushner, and there are a lot of other people engaged through other kinds of activities that are viewing this as a way, at least within the, which we call in the commission report.gov, we refer to as a way as you begin to modernize or re-engineer government, you could solve the cyber, you could at least put the appropriate technologies in place to make it more difficult if you're going to try to hack the U.S. government, protect it from a cyber attack kinds of things. So those things were all sort of merging together in that regard. Now the private sector side of it, Kirsten, companies?
We can, and then we'll jump to this, but if you want to talk, we were each going through kind of some of the key elements of the commission, and I don't think what we addressed specifically was looking at the industry interface with government. And we talked a lot about, the thing that the commission was focused on is we're not going to talk about public-private partnerships because that's a wasted term. But what is it? Tom referenced this. What does industry need from government? What does government need from industry? But how do we create the effective mechanism? And the NCP 3 recommendation,
right, exactly.
The commission is part of that. But if you want to elaborate.
Well,
a little
I
bit
think
more.
that basically they might not call it a private-public partnership, but they realized that they need to have relationships with people that have the capability and breadth to solve the problem. So they're going to end up, maybe it's more of a commercial, well, we'll see where it goes, but my sense is it could become more of a commercial relationship versus just a pure partnership relationship for a way to attract skill to solve the problem. So my sense is their instincts are taking them down a path of where they don't have the skills themselves, they have to form, and I'm on just the government, now we'll get into this, the standards and those other things, which we all think are very, very important, right? But fundamentally, tactically, kind of where they are at this point in time is maybe enter into a commercial structure that would give you the same benefits of a partnership with some economic incentive for the partners to participate, in this relationship. To be defined. I don't want to mislead anyone. Things are moving really fast. The other thing, though, I think back to the things that need to be done to deal with the broader, as you know, cyber issues, you have to deal with access points, which we can broaden that to the Internet of Things, so we can go back to the world we used to know, called phones, what have you. But you've got to deal with access points. You have to deal with multiple levels of authentication. You're going to have to do these sorts of things. You're going to have to establish through the appropriate government functions standards around definitions of access points, the cyber seal, as we call it, relative to the Internet of Things and those kinds of devices that have to be much more secure and safe, and then also consumer labeling and all the things that's in the report. I'm just repeating the report, but it's important that there's consumer awareness is elevated to the point where they understand that when you have that little device in your table at home and you say play your favorite song, it's also monitoring your behavior. So you might consider that before you listen to your favorite music versus do it the old-fashioned way. Load a CD, or put a record on for Tom and I. Not for the
I
LP,
still
right,
have
Tom?
vinyl. I still have vinyl.
Right.
So if you
Right,
look
I'm a
at-
little younger age.
I wanted to say,
Tom,
one thing that Sam mentioned is that we haven't talked about really is this issue of authentication and identity management.
and both entities actually discussed it.
Yeah, which is, if you look back, as our commission report says, if you look back at the breaches that most people are aware of over the last half decade or so, right? Most of them were actually a result of failures in identity management and authentication. At least at the probable, most relevant cause, right?
Yeah,
and we do talk a bit about the importance of this, because if you can solve this problem, it will be a fundamental enhancement of cybersecurity, and we call upon the federal government in the first instance, right, with respect to its interfaces with consumers, many Americans, through some of the most important portals that you have, the IRS, healthcare, VA, things like that, to look towards enhancing authentication and identity management, and get it to a different level, right, and begin to set an example going forward here, and also to insist, indeed at a basic level, throughout the federal government that enhanced authentication techniques are used.
And one of the things that I learned from the commission discussion on authentication, which I thought was important, because what we often hear is we need to encourage multi-factor authentication. If authentication isn't strong, you need to encourage multi-factor authentication. And we had two of the commissioners who were technical say, you can't prescribe what better authentication is, whether it's multi-factor, because that's limiting. And the language in the commission report actually encourages stronger authentication, because the idea there is that you're encouraging the innovation to make authentication better for whatever that enterprise needs. And I think that's an important point, because we talk about government and is it multi-factor, what is it? But you don't want to limit innovation by telling them what the goal is. And while it's a small but subtle shift, it's a pretty significant one in how we look at authentication and where it goes. Karen, do you want to talk at all about the CSIS report on the authentication piece? Or
Well, I can tell you that at one point we were saying we were going to back off of that altogether about going forward, about coming up with a national strategy and how you were going to do all this stuff, because what we really believed, and the discussion went down, is that the commercial market is they're very innovative. And what a lot of the people in the Washington, D.C. area didn't realize is that I have a FIPS 201 card that was issued to me from a private vendor. And the reason why I bought it, and now I don't even have to use it anymore because they went to total biometrics. And the reason why I use it is because it bypasses all the lines in the airport, and I can get right up to screening. and I don't have to stand in any lines, I don't have to do anything, and there's a commercial offering. And so any of you who go through Dulles is clear. The clear guys went like kind of bankrupt, restructured, but there's commercial offerings. And so to your point about limiting what type of stuff, they went to, okay, what's the best way that's the most cost-effective way so that we can then span this out to multiple airports and keep the price points down so that we are competitive, so that people will sign up for this and that we can be competitive in the market. And oh, by the way, now that they've done this, now they can partner with other people. They're doing work, the company that does this are doing works at football stadiums with the NFL to try to do how to do a bunch of different things. They're working with a lot of private sectors because they figured out what is the market incentives for me to buy into this, and they're using the technology and the standards that were developed by NIST and have clearly rolled out another solution that's cost effective for the consumer. So it actually embodies both parts of the recommendation. So based on that, we took on, okay, Rolls Space, you should do that because the market is continuously evolving because people want to do this, and we should then adopt market best practices. So we went along the way that you did, but we didn't prescribe something. This is one place where we tried to really not be as prescriptive because we could see that the market was evolving.
You know, just to add one thing, it's not just the market that changes, but as we had mentioned earlier, the bad guys change.
Right.
And so something that actually is effective today might literally not be effective by the close of today. And we had seen that when I was at the FBI, we were working on a financial fraud case. It was ACH fraud. And the fraud was $1 million, $5 million, $10 million, $20 million, $100 million. And what we found is that people were breaking into bank accounts of predominantly small and medium-sized businesses. And they would find their passwords. Typically, there was a keystroke logger on a machine. They'd go in with their credentials, and they'd just take all the money out of their account. What the banks were doing in response was they were adding multi-factor authentication. So they were giving out a dongle. And I said, look, you know, it might be that the bad guys have your username and password. We encourage you to change that, but of course, if there's a keystroke logger, that might last only for so long. So we're giving you this number that changes every number of seconds. And you know, make sure no one's looking behind your shoulder, but short of that, you're fine. 10 million in fraud, 100 million in fraud, attempted 400 million in fraud with the dongle in place. And how was it happening? This is multi-factor authentication. What happened was the bad guy decided to do what was called a man-in-the-browser attack. Through malware, changed the browser so that when anyone went to their bank, they actually weren't going to their bank. They were going to a web server in Eastern Europe that looked just like their bank. And it asked for the user ID and the password, which the people put in. And then it went back and it asked for that number, which people put in. And on the back end, they're putting it into the real server. And you're just seeing waiting, come back later. But they were able to actually take advantage of the fact that it was all in band. Once they had your computer, they had everything you put into your computer, from the password to the multi-factor authentication. And so it's very important, I think, to remain agnostic as to technology, not just because the technology gets better and changes, but because the bad guys respond. And we have to be nimble, and that's a problem, I think. We did focus a bit on procurement as well, that the government is least suited right now to be able to refresh its technology as opposed to kind of add on and you know, piece together, hobble together solutions in an area that the good guys have to be as nimble as the bad guys.
I do want to get into some of the procurement, but what both the task force and the commission talked a lot about was, or less about, was not the need for regulation. And I think both really put forth the idea that market forces should be given the opportunity to work. When market forces fail, then we need to create incentives. And when those incentives fail, then that is an opportunity for regulation. And I think when looking at authentication and some of the other technology approaches that we discussed, that became more and more, and particularly with IoT standards. I do want to go back to the question around authorities. As we're looking at government and as we're all looking for the EO to come out and understanding the structure, and particularly as we look at some of the restructuring or with a new individual coming in to be the National Security Advisor, how does that shift some of the EOP structure? But what is the opinion of each of you around how authorities for cybersecurity should be aligned within government, both within the EOP and within agencies, and where should that authority lie?
I think, Tom, you're the best.
I was going to say, Tom, you should start.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well, I have a bias towards the national security advisors. Right? I think that a couple of points. One is that the point that Karen and I were making earlier, though, is this insistence by the president that the agency and department heads are responsible for the cybersecurity in their agencies, right? And they'll be held accountable. That's a very important piece of this. That's leadership and accountability piece, first of all. And that's basically, that's a contract, if you will, between the president and the people that he hires to run the agencies and departments. That's part of the hiring conditions, right? Then you've hired thousands of people, right? This is the deal, right?
That's the deal, right.
This is the deal, first. Second, I do think that there needs to be a locus in the White House and in running the interagency process, which is of a high level, I would put it assistant to the president level, that can convene the various elements in the United States government that make policy on an interagency basis. No one agency is going to make policy on something complicated as cyber. You're going to have to bring people together through an ongoing process, and a process that works in a timely way to address policy issues. Third is that then you need, I think, at least two other things, right? You need to have a place where the standards are set and can be enforced, right? And that, in our judgment, was the CIO, right, in the federal government at OMB, right, who would kind of come into this, would get policy direction from this interagency team run by an assistant to the president, right, but would have real authority, including the authority to drive towards a common network, right, and reduce access points, as Sam was talking about, right, and also have the authority, if an agency or department wasn't performing, to take steps, right, including maybe taking them off the network, right, at some point. And on the other side, have a place in the government where kind of from end to end, you're servicing the networks, right, and you're providing the kinds of response mechanisms and things like that that the federal network needs. I think that's essentially the way we talked about authorities in the government. But the last piece I'll say in this is it needs to be informed on a regular basis by interaction with the private sector, and kind of a keen and current. It would be best to have machine-to-machine understanding of what's going on, right, in terms of vulnerabilities in the private sector, and again with a goal towards not having one of these things succeed twice. Last thing I'll say about this is that Steve's exactly right that that's another piece of this, right, an important piece of this is the deterrence piece, right, and that, that's the kind of thing that can only be developed through an interagency policy development process, right? And we are in the midst, I think, as a government, of still working through these kind of doctrinal and all of government deterrence efforts.
Let me take that in a little. Steve, did you want to say something?
There are just a couple of points, because I think there's no doubt that the heads of agencies need to have responsibilities, but I can't help but caution that they may be being set up to fail, right? I mean, if they don't have the tools to create the security that we on the commission were hearing from the private sector, right? They don't have the $600 million and 2,000 people that are going to be doing this full time. There is a drain, both in terms of the personnel skills that they have, the movement of those skills, even between agencies, even if not out of the government, their ability to procure new technologies. So I do want to make sure that it's one thing to say that they're responsible. Yeah. I agree that they need responsibility, but that responsibility in my mind is a leadership role that will bring to the fore what the real issues are. And if we look at the last draft executive order, to the extent that the leaked order was correct, and a reflection of what the administration is thinking, we see a big focus on risk management principles, which include assessing what the risks are, which I think every leader must do, and then addressing how you're either going to mitigate or accept that risk, and why. And that every leader can do. So what I would suspect is at the end of the day, the real what we really mean by saying that the leader is responsible is they're responsible for assessing the situation, taking this seriously, and bringing to the forefront whatever those issues are. So if the issues are, you're expecting me to be able to do A, B, and C, which are perfectly reasonable, but you have not provided me in a legitimate way. I mean, we're not looking for, crying if, I've got too much work to do. Everyone's got that problem. But if it really is, you're asking me to be able to implement this solution, which only operates on this operating system because it's the operating system that's been used in the last 3 years, but we only have hardware from, that's 10 years old, then it has to be identified.
Yeah.
And OMB, I think then, and I think it's set up in that way, that leaders really can figure out what they need, and that it's not that we're asking them to ensure perfect security. We're asking them to assess their environments and bring that up to this place within the White House that you're talking about to say, here are the real challenges that we're facing.
I totally agree with that too. And this is important. I mean, the proposition that every department and agency in the U.S. government can provide 21st century state-of-the-art cybersecurity is not, that's not going to happen, right? And you have to be able to provide through shared services kind of structure, through, I talked about that second piece in the government of being able to come forward and say, we can provide you with the expertise, right? With the appropriate applications, and we can help you respond, because at the end of the day, resilience is a critical part, right, of any plan here. But that needs to be focused at the central part of the government, right? That can provide these kinds of shared services, insights, people, and state-of-the-art capabilities, and help with resilience and response.
Yeah, I think that's a very important part.
Yeah.
Well, and okay, so as a person who sat in the White House, who had to implement policy that came from the policy apparatus, okay? So the idea is that the federal government spends $80 billion, so you should lead from example. And so if these are the federal agencies and they're the major buyer in a lot of the federal budget, a lot of the government are their major clients for a lot of these companies. So you should lead by example about these are the standards, this is the policy the administration has set up, this is the way we're going to go. To drive down on the nuance of what Steve is saying, I think we're only fooling ourselves right now if we believe that OMB and in this climate that we have, that you're going to take $80 billion of legacy systems, not just what the IT, that you're going to take that and lift and shift it and re-engineer it into a 21st century solution. That's just not going to happen. That's cost prohibitive. And so what has happened when you ask about the authorities, I think everybody's been dancing around the issues instead of just saying, look, this stuff is sunk cost, and this is what it is. And there's a bunch of antibodies around that, and whether we like it or not, private industry makes a lot of money off of keeping those things old, okay? So even if we were to shift, next thing you know, there's this whole other external force that would come and say, keep all these things in place, because you're going to end up changing revenue streams for people. So we need to be realistic in what's actually going to happen. But the other part of this is when a new secretary comes on board, a CIO shouldn't be going in there from that department or agency and saying, I need $600 million to re-engineer this old solution, and nobody's ever listened to me, and those idiots over at OMB want me to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, it's the same thing. You have to have the staff that goes into the secretary, just like it happens in a board. When they come to the board of directors, the investment is reviewed as it relates to the risk. Where do you want this entity to go? Is it a good, worthwhile capital investment, so that you can then make the argument to the board that this is what you want to do? That's where we are right now. And we don't necessarily have the staff. You have a certain amount of CIOs, and I'll be the one who says this, that like to whine and say, oh, I need a seat at the table. And once they get there, it's death by PowerPoint, and they're talking way beyond or down in the weeds, and a secretary doesn't want to hear it. Just like a chairman of a board wouldn't want to hear that level of detail down to certain things. You have to be able to articulate this in a way that it has parameters around it that reflects reality.
And Karen, I think the other point to that the Commission called out and others, but looking at this, it's also the budget cycle, right?
That's
that's
right.
very different from a private company.
Right.
The budget cycle is created in such a way that it really exacerbates the short-term vision, because you've got to use this money. So that's where a lot of the legacy use and reuse comes from, because you have to buy something quickly and show that you have the accountability for it. So altering the budget cycle and looking at this is a huge part of this. And I think that leads to something that each of you have talked about a little bit, have touched on, which is, put it in a two-pronged way, it's how do we look at procurement right now, and how do we effectively revise it in a way that can allow us to create these goals that we're all talking about. But then, and Sam, I don't know if you can talk a little bit more specifically to this, but the discussion around a technology overhaul of government that's being discussed and that we've heard in the news and all of that, how does that interface then with procurement? Are they seen as two different things, but how can we create that technology, innovative, effective environment that everybody seeks as a goal?
Well, maybe you can answer the question that I couldn't get answered as one of the reasons I was late. How are you going to change the system?
Okay, so we put this
Because
in
I
our
could draw you the technology roadmap, I could give you the steps, I could tell you
No, and
And so
how
what's
are
the
you gonna-
obstacle
But
to
we
that?
laid out, no. We laid out the vision of what we thought should happen, okay? And this is based on, when you asked that, we had a big debate in CSIS task force on this. Really, what should it be? And it really comes down to what is the role of a federal agency, so to speak, or the federal government, right, in this arena. And so the analogy that we are using now to describe what we're saying is the federal government agencies, $80 billion, right, they use telephones all the time. They are not building telephones. They use cars. They are not building cars except for Department of Defense. So you guys like .mil, and they're still going out and they're still having private industry build them. So why are we building IT technical solutions in the federal government? We shouldn't be. Private industry is part of this stuff. We are users of technology. So what we laid out is shared services and the commodity IT and everything that the Obama administration started was for cost efficiency. So I'm back to Steve's point. It was for cost efficiencies, and that's why it dies on the vine, because people are willing to argue, oh, no, I got to do this and I have to do that. But if we actually looked at those models in shared services, and Tom talked about this, and we looked at it from a national security perspective, like, okay, the guiding principle is information that the government collects belongs to the user, right? So if an administration does that, then all international, national policies would evolve from that. Now your technical solutions could evolve from that. And now what you're doing is you're looking at shared services under that guiding principle, dealing with what technologies are available. Now all of a sudden cloud is not so insurmountable. It's not an insurmountable solution. We start at, here's the technology, now how do we integrate it in? It really should be, what are the guiding principles of what does the federal government do and what is a digital government, what are those services that a digital government should do? Don't look at what we're spending over here. What are the digital government services that we should be doing? How do you secure them? Can they go to transactional base? And then how do you then innovate what that looks like? Okay, you want to know that the user is the user when they're going through TSA, right? Or that when I'm doing IRS stuff. Well, how do you actually look at that transaction? Who can actually do in-person proofing of the IRS transactions? Well, all the tax providers can, right? The government can't do all of that. Because that would then become cost prohibitive. So now you have to develop a solution with them. There are ways that you can do this that takes advantage of it. We were a little too early with our lines of business during my tenure because we got caught up into cost efficiencies and A76 and contracting out and outsourcing. When in fact, what you're really looking at, what should digital government services be? What should they look like? What information should the government collect? And how should they protect it? And then based on that, you can design a solution and then tell me how much it's going to cost per transaction.
But inherent in that is somebody sharing something.
Yes.
So how do you solve this issue where you have a defined budget and you have a subcommittee on the Hill?
Okay.
So because inherent in that solution, somebody shared. Somebody made the investment up front
Yes.
to build this thing you discussed.
Yes.
I can talk about how to get it funded, but somebody did that. And then somebody got the benefits of it, so therefore they shared versus how they're doing it today.
So what I also believe that the way the procurement system, because I've analyzed this 50 bazillion ways to Sunday as well, is that some things were ahead of the solution. In the traditional ways that we're looking at things, like you hear everybody talk about shared savings and blah, 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 and all this. Okay, those aren't going to work. Okay, that's not going to work. What I think would work, this is Karen Evans thinking this, okay? What would work is a little tweak in the procurement system that would allow more, and this is happening in state and local government, so in full disclosure, I sit on a board that does this, is capital investment from the private sector. So what ends up happening is, and we even tried this, and so these energy contracts over at Department of Energy don't work either because CBO scored those as leases. So we still incur the cost. So you have to think about the CBO scoring. This is really wonky stuff here. But the idea is that private industry, if IBM in your days wanted to get involved with the federal government, you said, hey, we've looked at, I'm going to pick the VA because everybody wants to solve the VA problem. You know they have to make medical appointments, right? Everybody knows that medical appointments have to happen all across the nation. They know how many appointments are happening or should be happening per month. That's a transaction. You can say, this is how many transactions that we have to make with this many partners in these geographic locations. We are willing to pay, I'm just going to say, $1 a transaction. So it could be something like you could get $2 million, every week because of the amount of transactions if you put a solution in place. Private industry does this now. Whenever they bid on contracts, they do capital investment to start bidding on the contract. This is just putting that process on steroids and getting private investment saying, you know what? We want those transactions. And there's a company right now that deals with the same user group called USAA that actually has all these transactions. They could say for a small incremental capital investment, and the government doesn't have to do anything. The government says that I have to have it running by the first of the year. And so everybody bids it. You could do a traditional bid, you could do this no cost, this private investment bid. And then the shifting of the risk shifts to private industry because the incentive is now there for them to get that solution up and running by the time period you need it because you're now going to pay on a transaction basis. And as far as Congress is concerned, that goes right along with the appropriation cycle because you know exactly how many transactions you're going to do, and you can only do them if funds are available. And so, and it's one little line that has to open up the mind of everybody, which is we would take private investment, and that they wouldn't score it that way.
Well, and I think the procurement issue is clearly, there are these models, and I think this could be an interesting discussion on its own, because I think the conversations that we had on the commission, as I'm sure you did, is looking at it from the private side and versus industry. I would like to jump to one more topic before we open it up to questions. We've talked a little bit about threat deterrence, and that one of the conversations that came up a lot over the course of the commission, and even just within the last 12 months, has been nation state and how does industry protect itself from nation state actors, and what is the role of government in doing so. And the commission went through a lot of different discussions and deliberations around what the position should be on that. And I think, and it's a question that often the private sector talks about. Both the task force and the commission had representatives from industry, both on the West Coast, the East Coast, and so there is a different view sometimes when you can draw those concentric circles around Washington, and you're talking about a company that's getting breached on the West Coast. And one of our commissioners asked the question, what is my responsibility to respond to this breach, and making sure that my response is aligned with U.S. government policy? And so I would like just to pose that question to the four of you, because we didn't really put forth a recommendation, but that idea of threat deterrence and the intersection of nation-state response, both for industry and government.
Well, I think there's a part of our report that states that the U.S. government has unique roles in some areas, but that it's not without coordination and sometimes consultation with the private sector. When I think about threat deterrence, I really think about the need for three things: detection, attribution, and penalty. There are other people that talk about deterrence as, if you have a lot of vulnerability mitigation and they can't get in the first 100 times, that's a deterrent. They'll go somewhere else because it's too hard. Let's just take that off the table for me. So I think of it very much in terms of you got to detect. Attribution doesn't necessarily mean the person behind the keyboard. You could have a responsibility model, meaning it's coming from your geographical area. Take care of it. If you don't, we're going to have further conversations. And then we have to figure out what we're going to do about it. And I think that historically we haven't done a very good job of using all of our elements of national power and aligning them. And this is classic stuff, right? You've got that DIME LE model: diplomatic, informational, military, economic, and law enforcement. And the government has to stop thinking that that's just its own capabilities. These are both government and private sector capabilities in each of those areas, and they're international. During our commission report, we had a submission from Harvard University, a gentleman named Leonard Marcus, who, with a colleague, developed this concept called meta-leadership. And part of that I thought was very, I think, helpful in thinking about this. And the concept was that a lot of this is a leadership issue, meaning that the problems and the solutions are out there already or easily obtainable. But how does someone get them all aligned together? And so I think that the government's role in this, in figuring this out, in aligning it, in making sure that the resources we spend are consistent with threat deterrence. Right now, the FBI, which is the lead in terms of resources for cyber crime, maybe has a few hundred people out of 14,000 agents that are working this. The numbers pale in comparison to what we're doing on the vulnerability mitigation side. And I think of it as a classic conductor of an orchestra. The first thing you have to do is figure out what music you're all playing. And that gets back to the strategic discussion we're talking about. And then what are the penalties that we're looking? Those make a difference depending on who the adversary is. China does not respond the same as Russia. Neither China nor Russia respond the same way as you would think they would day to day or year to year. We have not focused on career intelligence analysts that do what I would call options analysis in this space, that once you figure out what the threat is, who the threat actor is, what's likely to work and deter them. The government, I think, did a very good job in the last administration focusing on PRC economic espionage. And it came up from a diplomatic perspective, right? This was not just, we're going to take, we're going to make a military threat, or we're going to put it all in law enforcement, or it's all in the intelligence community. It was a combined approach. Every senior level meeting, this was discussed with the PRC delegation. Then you did see the Department of Justice say, we're serious about this, and put out indictments. Now, everyone mocked that. Are you really going to arrest these people? But then when the next statement was, and now we're going to release the names of companies that are the beneficiaries of this ill-gotten intellectual property, ears perked up a little bit because everyone knew that this was serious. So when we think about deterrence, it really is this all of government with private sector and international approach, and that's really hard to do. But it can be done. And I think that the private sector has a right to be extremely concerned with how it's done for two reasons. One, is it being done? Because if it's not, you can't say to the private sector it cannot defend itself if no one is defending it, right? I think it's fair to say that if the government says we're defending you from international aggression, stand down, that's probably a reasonable request. But it's not so reasonable to say we're not protecting you and you can't protect yourself, and it's certainly not what the Constitution would envision. But the second thing is that the private sector is going to have the blowback of a lot of what the government does in response, and the government doesn't often consider that because the networks are going to be used are private sector networks. The end retaliation might be against private sector resources, and so that discussion has to occur. So it's a complicated area, of course. I fear that because it involves so many equities and we don't have a lot of analysis in the options space going on, that we just keep kicking that can down the road a little bit. But we've got to get serious about it.
No, I agree with that. I'll just take 10 seconds on it. On the multi, Steve's exactly right. It's kind of an all of government. Meta leadership is kind of the right response to that. The Chinese example is an interesting example. I kicked that off with a speech at the Asia Society in the spring of 2013, basically calling them out on it publicly. And then we undertook a multi-year, multifaceted effort. Some of the stuff was done, all the tools of government,
right,
if you will,
right.
to get to a better place on that. The other thing we talked about in the report, Kirsten, is the importance of norm setting internationally, which is powerful and I think underappreciated, frankly. And so we talked in the commission and in the report about pushing forward on norms with like-minded nations in the first instance, right? Kind of an alliance kind of approach, it's an important step. We started that, but an important step to continue to go forward on. Sam, I interrupted.
No, I was going to add, I was going to make Tom's point on norms. I think norms are very, very important from the private sector's point of view, primarily because it gives them the flexibility to work within the norms. You don't want them out there being mavericks. They don't want to be mavericks themselves. Right. I mean, people used to make the argument to me when I was working, well, IBM has all this technical capability. You could strike back. And but we don't view ourselves as someone taking on a nation state. I mean, we would help some other entity strike back, you know, right? We're not going to be, I don't want to be the CEO of a company that struck back against Russia or someplace like that, you know, right? I mean, we'll make it hard for them to get in, but we're not going to use our technology to hit back, right?
And I would add one more thing. A lot of the first recommendation 1.1, talks about a coordinated international effort to mitigate these large-scale threats at the higher level, and we talked about botnets in particular. And if you think about botnets, a lot of that does get rid of the nation-state capability, right? When you see North Korea attack Sony, a lot of this is being done through botnets. When the PRC espionage campaign were botnets, Russian infrastructure denial. So if you know, going against power grid, these are DDoSes that are enabled by botnets. Iranian claims that Iran went after the financial services sector, again, botnets. And then, of course, all the criminal conduct that we see, whether it's, you know, all of the credential theft or botnets. So if we actually can clean up some of that ecosystem, you'll see that the nation states have fewer places to hide. And tradecraft is a very difficult thing to change very quickly. So you get back to that identification and attribution much more quickly if we could clean up a lot of this environment, and then it really does get to political will of what we're going to do about it. But it no longer is the argument, well, it's going to take us a year just to figure out who did it.
One of the elements that the Commission discussed on the international piece that Tom referenced on, and Sam with the norms, was bringing the U.S. together with like-minded nations that are at similar economic powers, like Japan and India, to come together to establish some of these norms, which I think is one of these pieces that the Commission identified as something it wanted to address, it wasn't asked to address, but clearly something that is on everybody's mind.
And I've been talking, I mean, a friend of mine is now Secretary of State, I've been talking with him about the importance, the role of state in taking leadership here to establish these norms. And Rex is very understanding of that and would like to do something. He's just trying to find his staff at the moment. So he has a list of frustrations beyond international norms for cyber.
And no position descriptions. Before we close out and I ask each of you for any closing comments, I want to just allow any questions, time for any questions from the audience. Yeah, Rick.
Hi, Rick Weber at Insight Cybersecurity. So Sam, you just came back from the White House. What's the timeline on the executive order?
I don't know. I'm going back over at 2 o'clock. Maybe you should ask me at 4.
All right, I'll call you.
Actually, my sense is that, this is one person's observation, take it for what it's worth. It's moving along, and maybe within a week or so, we could see something. But I would have said that 2 or 3 weeks ago as well. So I don't want to set a bar for them. They're working through the process. But I think it's far enough along that in this meeting I have this afternoon, if they're actually going to, well, the way the meeting's set up is they're going to take me through it to get a reaction. So that means it's pretty far along, obviously, if they're looking for some kind of feedback.
Yeah.
Daniel Arnado from the University of Washington. I'm just curious, like kind of the larger issue of the new administration seems to me that they don't have a lot of organization around a lot of issues, but particularly complicated ones like cybersecurity. So they don't have a CISO, they don't have a CIO, they don't have people in these kind of mid-level roles. And I think you said, Tom, that these need to be driven by the CEO of an organization in a lot of cases. And it seems to me that the CEO of the government doesn't really have an understanding of computers or basic security measures like not having an Android phone that is unsecured. So if there isn't really people driving the process either at the top through to the mid-level all the way down, it seems to me like you're going to have challenges. So I just wanted to get your perspective on whether you think these kind of issues can really be addressed comprehensively with this kind of administration.
Well, Tom, you've been inside the White House, I guess.
Well, no, it'll be driven by the interagency process, which I think is what's going on right now, right? They have an excellent national security advisor, and Tom Bossard is well known to a lot of people in this world as in this area. I think that they have the leader, a senior leadership within the government right now to start to pull together a policy approach, right? And then you need to move through the personnel process. But I think that the key policy-making entity is the White House-focused interagency process, And they have two very good people, I think, now who are running their process.
The one thing that I would like to say on this is that we are looking at this administration through the lens of what has been in the past. And I think, because you mentioned like CISOs and all this other stuff like that, I know that we specifically, as we were looking at things, we were really looking at what are the right roles and do all these roles need to exist? So I know our paper, the task force specifically talked about this, that you don't need a chief information officer, a chief innovation officer, a chief information security officer, a chief digital officer. I mean, there are so many chiefs in these agencies, and the way that, so I think you might want to take off the lens of this is the traditional way of looking at it. And the administration's really, I believe, based on the recommendations. They don't have to take things that we did through transition. Those are all recommendations going forward. Is that it's an opportunity to be able to say, what do you really want these roles to do, and what do you really want these jobs to accomplish? So just because certain positions aren't filled doesn't mean that they're not working on the issues and that the policies aren't being discussed.
And I think, Karen, one of the things in what we've seen in one of the EOs that came out, and this was something I know you talked to the commission about, was this idea of enterprise risk management.
Right.
And so I think that's a good demonstration of if you're truly managing the risk, then what are the positions that you need to manage that risk?
Right.
And in the current environment with the current threats, how does all of that sync up? And we're restructuring to accommodate where the threats are.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. I mean, I think they're taking all that input and they're digesting it. And they're also, and they still have to, whatever it is, fill another 3,000 jobs. So, they're in this point of transition, so it's pretty tough to judge them one way or the other. I mean, they have, at least as I listen to what they've been saying, they are taking all those inputs, they're digesting all those inputs, they're not discarding the inputs, they're just trying to figure out how do you sort through all this stuff and then fill all these jobs pragmatically, get the jobs filled at the same time. So they have a lot of work.
And I know we've hit the time and people have to leave. I want to thank the panelists very much for this thoughtful conversation and also for the work that you produced over the last 12 months and in some cases longer. And we all look forward to Sam, if you want us to reconvene at 4:30, we're more than happy. But thank you very much,
I'll fax
everybody.
it out to everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.
Tweet.